Hi, Will. Welcome back to the Animal Tone podcast.
Oh, thanks. It's great to be back.
I think legitimate authority helps me think about this in several ways. One, when we think about politics now, I'm inclined then to say, well, if we're thinking about legitimate authority and animals, there's one way in which we could look at animal societies and collectivities and think about how they have structured legitimate governance structures themselves. And this kind of dismantles that idea that politics is in and of itself a human-centric idea. And then the second way is, well, how do we include or animals in human political structures? So how are animals part of our existing collectivities? Now, which of those, like, do you look at both of these two types of structures, or which of these are you interested, or at least would you agree with that kind of synopsis of you could think
Yeah.
about legitimate authority in these two ways?
So Sue and I actually just finished a paper in which we talk about three models.
Hey, I was two
So,
thirds of the way there.
so one is, how do we include animals in human decision making? So we start from uh, uh, things like existing national political systems, and ask, how do we ensure that the interests of animals are adequately represented? And this is typically the way this model works is to imagine that we might appoint some humans to speak on behalf of animals. So these could be animal advocates, animal representatives. So they're modest and ambitious versions of this. The modest version is just that you might have someone who would be asked or authorized to speak on behalf of animals at a parliamentary committee, say, but who wouldn't necessarily have a right to vote. They're just a kind of they have an advisory function. The ambitious version is you might actually imagine setting aside parliamentary seats for animals, and some people have proposed it. Like 10 seats in the House of Parliament would be set aside for people who are whose task it is to advocate for and represent the interests of animals. So we call that politics on behalf of animals. So, and that's one way to include animals, is we can think about who appointing or electing some humans to act on behalf of animals within human politics. The second model, as you said, is to instead think about the ways in which animals govern themselves, that they too face this task of making collective decisions. They too have to construct legitimate authority, precisely because animals aren't just biologically determined. They confront a whole slew of complicated decisions they need to make, and often need to make collectively. And so, just like humans, they face a challenge about how to ensure that authority, that there is some authority in the community to make these decisions, and that authority is perceived as legitimate by others. And so this is actually a huge area of ethological research, which I think is just fascinating. That is all the different kinds of procedures that animal communities use to basically construct legitimate authority. And in some cases, it's about seniority, so that the elder members of the community have a more of a vote on certain decisions. In other cases, it's a bit more majoritarian. In some cases, it depends on what issues at stake. That certain members of the community are seen as having authority on some issues, perhaps because they have specialized knowledge about it, but on other issues, they may not be the authorities. So it's not like there's a single authority structure for all issues. Anyway, so we can start thinking. So from our view, this is politics. We call this politics by animals. So we have politics on behalf of animals, which humans speak on behalf of animals, and here we have politics by animals, in which they are governing themselves, and they are making choices. They're making decisions according to authority structures. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that they do that, and that they have a right to do that, and that what we should be trying to do in our relations with wild animals is not only or necessarily to be thinking about how we relate to them one by one and respect their individual rights, but also respect, I feel like, their collective right to govern themselves. They have a right to politics. They have a right to engage in their own politics. And that means we should not do anything that would undermine their authority relations. And there's some really interesting work that's done on how humans do intentionally or unintentionally undermine these authority relations within wild animal communities. So there's these famous studies about with elephant troops that if the elder like matriarchs are hunted, then sometimes the younger elephants go rogue because they're not subject to a legitimate authority within the community, and then they become dangerous to other members of the community as well as to other animals and humans nearby, and so it's really important for the well-being of that community and its relations with others that these authority structures be
Isn't
maintained.
another example with wolves? And I think this is quite topical right now. When folks hunt wolves, they tend to the whole packs can kind of
Yeah,
disentangle. Mm-hmm.
yeah. So that's the second model. So we have politics on behalf of animals, we have politics by animals, and then the third model, which is harder, um, uh, which I think we need to think more about, is what we call politics with animals. So are there times and places? So in the first model, it's basically humans are doing all the politics. Some of them are asked to speak on behalf of animals, but politics is understood as humans deliberating with humans about what to do, even if some of those humans are asked to speak on behalf of animals. The second one is politics is by animals amongst with other animals. But is it possible to imagine that we have politics with animals? That this is something we do together, something that we jointly do. So we sometimes call it joint politics. And so that's our one example that we've looked at for that is farmed animal sanctuaries. So in that case, we can think about farmed animal sanctuaries as microsites in which these formerly farmed animals who've been rescued from industrial agriculture and the humans need to make a bunch of decisions. And at least in some sanctuaries, they are really committed to trying to make these decisions together. And so they're trying to think about how it's not just that they'd have someone speaking on behalf of animals, and it's not just that they'd let animals make their own decisions, although both of those also happen, but that they'd be trying to think about a process by which the animals could propose something to the humans, and the humans could propose something to the animals, and that what would emerge is the outcome of an iterative process of bargaining, negotiation, trial, and experiment. And so we think that at least at some farmed animal sanctuaries, we could really, these are not, for all sorts of reasons, they're not, as it were, ideal. These are not the ideal conditions to be experimenting in joint politics, partly because the animals often are highly traumatized, from their experience in industrialized agriculture and their limits on resources and so on. But still, we think that many of the decisions that are made about routines, about the way in which physical space is organized, about what kinds of activities are undertaken, about what kinds of relationships within and across species, all of these really can be described as jointly authored, the result of joint politics.